Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We are ready to get started. Let's get started. Yaniv, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So my name is Zarecki, and I'm VP Marketing here at Continuity. And with me today is Yaniv Valik, our VP Product. Hi, Yaniv.
Hi, everyone.
And in today's webinar, we'll cover a couple of topics, very interesting topics. We'll start by talking about cyber attacks. Where are they going and what kind of trends do we see there? And more importantly, maybe is how can you prepare for the next inevitable cyber attack? We'll then talk about some unspoken protection gaps in your strategy, as well as some challenges in your cyber resilience strategy. And we'll end by giving you some very practical recommendations about what you can do to better prepare and better protect your critical assets. And of course, as usual, we'll end with a Q&A session. So get your questions ready, and you'll be able to submit them throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar, and we will address them at the end. So with that, let's get started. So when we look at some recent, headlines about cyber attacks, we see that they're happening all the time, more and more. They're becoming more sophisticated. The attackers are becoming more sophisticated, and they cover all industries, including finance and government and energy. Nobody can escape that. And, we all heard about the Baltimore ransomware attack just a couple of weeks ago, and we still remember the painful Equifax situation just a couple of years ago. Yaniv, can you share more information about these attacks?
Sure, Iris. So you mentioned Baltimore, but they are not alone. Wolters Kluwer and Setrom have also suffered recently from a cyber attack, as well as many other firms. And what's common to Baltimore, Wolters Kluwer, and Setrom is that they suffered from a malware infection that was used to generate a ransomware attack, but not just a single desktop was affected. The attack targeted critical systems within the organization, and significant parts of the production network were lost. All these organizations were caught unprepared and required weeks and even months to recover the data and the service. Baltimore stated that it will take them months to recover.
Wow. And I think we see a similar picture in the next slide, which takes some statistics from a recent, very interesting research by Forbes and IBM. And what we can see in this research is that more than 50 of the surveyed organizations have experienced at least one cyber attack in the last 3 years. So that's an amazing number. But maybe other key findings are that only 42 of the executives that were surveyed are confident that they could recover from a cyber attack without impacting their business. I think that's an amazing number, 42%. And 13% admit that they lost data and or faced downtime as a result of a security breach. So very interesting statistics in this research. But Yaniv, how do organizations typically prepare? What do they do? What can they do to make sure they are ready for the inevitable cyber attack?
So as a basis, most information security organizations follow a cybersecurity framework, such as the NIST framework that you can see in front of you, which is fairly common. The NIST framework includes 5 pillars. The first one is identifying assets and critical infrastructure, protecting those assets and infrastructure, detecting cyber events as they occur, whether it's anomalies or suspected behavior, responding to cyber incidents, and recovering back from cyber incidents to normal operations. But the framework is just a starting point. You need to have the right tools and knowledge in order to implement the required processes and keep information secured. And today I will focus on 2 security challenges, one being in the identify and protect domain, and the second one in the recovery domain. And let's start with the very first one, the challenge of identifying and protection. And specifically, through dialogue with information security executives and leading institutions, we learned that enterprise organizations have tools to assess and validate the security configuration of desktop, servers, and virtual machines. They use tools like Nessus and Qualys and Rapid7 to detect vulnerabilities and security misconfigurations. However, when it comes to the storage systems, enterprises do not have the ability to assess the security of those systems in a repeatable and trackable manner. And those are the systems that, in fact, store petabytes of critical data. All databases, application data, user data, and files are kept on storage systems. There is no comprehensive way to detect vulnerabilities, vendor best practice violations, non-compliance with standards, or security baselines.
Wow, so you're saying that organizations protect the perimeter, but they don't protect the core data storage systems?
That's exactly right. You know, as more and more organizations realize that a breach is a matter of when rather than a matter of if, it's crucial to protect and secure all network systems, including those systems that contain the very critical data, and not just those systems that are on the perimeter. And let's take a quick look at what could go wrong in the event of an attack on the storage system. So just imagine what could happen if an attacker obtains the credentials of the storage administrator, or if malware is installed on a storage management system. So some of those scenarios could lead to deletion of data, corrupting storage volumes. They could lead to data theft. They could lead to encryption of the data that is stored on those storage volumes. Attackers could potentially delete all access configuration and causing a widespread outage within the organization. Or they could, in fact, delete both the data that is stored on those systems as well as the recovery or backup copies.
Scary.
And yeah, it's indeed quite a chaotic scenario. And when you look at a storage system and how storage systems are being used in a normal data centers, so you have, as depicted in this diagram, you have a number of storage systems, which in turn are connected to the network, which in turn are connected to dozens or hundreds of physical servers, which in turn serve hundreds or thousands of virtual machines. And all those machines are running the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 applications of the organization. And a compromised storage array will jeopardize the data and availability of all those applications and can be extremely destructive for any organization. And then recovery of a storage system is highly complex, considering the dependencies and considering that it's not a commonly exercised scenario.
So what should organizations do to better protect their storage?
So that's a good question. And we at Continuity, we marked 4 key components for validating the security of data storage systems. The first one is compliance with standards, meeting the requirements of NIST, CIS, ISO, PCI, and many other standards. And one of the key challenges here is to interpret rather high-level requirements into actionable steps for each and every storage vendor and model. And then another key aspect is vendor best practices. If you look at the EMC, Brocade, NetApp, and all other vendors, they publish security guides and security knowledge base article per system and model, and those get updated rather quickly. There is no one source for all the best practices, so organizations need to collect those best practices and guidelines and make sure they have a comprehensive and up-to-date repository of best practices. And then another key component is common vulnerabilities and exposures, which organizations must detect. Storage systems, very much like host operating systems, suffer from vulnerabilities which could be exploited by attackers. And last, we have the internal baseline requirement component, which every organization defines what is the minimal security configuration the organization expects for each and every device, and storage systems are no different at that respect. And considering all those four components, you could have hundreds and thousands of best practices and guidelines that keep changing. And some of the challenges here is to do it in a repeatable way, in a trackable way, and to do it at scale.
Yep. Can you give us some examples of what these standards and best practices might look like?
Sure. So I've prepared a few examples for you. This first example is about compliance with a CAS control requirement. It's also relevant for NIST and ISO and PCI and many other standards. And CAS control 6.5 states that organizations must aggregate audit log to a central log management system for analysis and review. And the rationale here is to enable organizations to detect anomalies, to detect suspicious behavior, to have a log retention, immutable log, and accurate logs that would enable them to do forensics, and then also to provide evidence in court if needed. And this means that organizations need to understand how to enable audit logging, how to configure the relevant events, how to move and how to forward the log to a central repository for retention and immutability. And you need to do that for each and every system. You need to do that for data domain, for NetApp, for Brocade. It could be different from one system to another, and the capabilities could be different for each and every storage device. Let's move on to another example. This is an example of a vendor best practice. This one is from Brocade, which have a SAN zoning best practice. Zoning is used to control access to storage devices. And the best practice from Brocade is to use PWWN method for zoning and not the domain port identification method. The rationale here is that when you use domain port identification in certain circumstances, attackers may obtain unauthorized access to storage. Another best practice is to configure device control policies to prevent PWWN spoofing. And for this best practice, organizations want to understand how to configure zoning in a secure way for the different Brocade models and versions. And this is also applicable for other SAN switches, whether it's Cisco, QLogic, IBM, HP, and so forth. And obviously, they also need to understand how to validate that the zoning configuration remains secure over time as things change. Let's see one more example. And this is a screenshot we took from cvedetails.com. And as you can see here, it reports on a vulnerability for an EMC Isilon system, which in certain versions is exposed to a privilege escalation vulnerability, could be exploited by attackers, received a rather high score, high risk score. And obviously, just like you have vulnerabilities for Linux and Windows systems, you also have vulnerabilities for storage systems. And one thing to take into consideration here is that many vulnerability scanning tools do not have the required APIs, the required commands, and the required knowledge to detect vulnerabilities at the storage level. So it requires either selecting the appropriate tools or writing the relevant scripts or doing it manually, which of course is the least preferred option. Now, there are plenty of other examples of potential risk, whether it's from standards, vendor best practices, CVEs, and so forth. But what's really important to realize is that there are hundreds and potentially thousands of security configuration best practices for the storage environment, where massive amounts of critical data is stored. More and more organizations are working today to resolve this security gap, and they seek the process, the tools, and the knowledge to perform this validation in a repeatable and trackable manner that suits the large scale of an enterprise organization.
Thank you, Yaniv. Let's move on to the second challenge, your ability to recover from a cyber attack. And what we see recently more and more is that cyber resilience is becoming mandatory. We see a lot of regulations, both in the US and Europe, and specifically for financial organizations and banks. And they talk about extending cybersecurity to also cover resilience and recovery. They talk specifically about making sure you're able to recover your critical operations, resume your critical operation within 2 hours. And they talk specifically about your data and how many copies you need to restore, where do you need to store them, everything thinking about a ransomware attack, which we see more and more recently. So there is a lot of regulations, but Yaniv, these big financial organizations, I'm sure they already have a comprehensive disaster recovery plan in place. Is it sufficient to successfully recover from a cyber attack?
Right, that's a good question, Iris. And sure, as the attacks get more and more sophisticated and more enterprises are hit, the regulators are right to be concerned about the ability to recover from a cyber attack. Organizations have spent significant time, effort, and budget on being prepared to recover from a natural disaster or a human error. But recovering from a cyber attack is a far more complex scenario given the malicious intent. A malware or other form of attack could potentially affect also the recovery systems, leaving the organizations at a state where recovery is simply not an option. For a financial services company, this is probably the worst nightmare. Some of the doomsday scenarios that we think about are a ransomware attack where the production is encrypted, but also the recovery and backup copies are encrypted. Or a scenario where the attacker compromised the production data and deleted the recovery and backup copies. Now, being able to recover from a ransomware or other form of attacks at any given time is a huge challenge, especially for financials who simply cannot afford to lose data.
Right. So we covered two challenges, one mostly around protecting your storage environment, and the second one regarding cyber resilience and your ability to recover. Let's move on to the last part of the webinar and talk about some practical recommendations we can give to organizations in order to address those challenges.
Right, so let's start with storage security. And our first recommendation is about vulnerability management. Every information security organization has this vulnerability management function, and the scope of vulnerability management usually includes the host operating systems, the database, web application, and desktops. And our recommendation is to extend the scope of vulnerability management to include also the storage environment. It's essential for vulnerability management to strive to have full stack security and not focus solely on those systems that are on the perimeter, but also on the core data storage systems. It doesn't make sense to leave storage security control in the hands of the storage administrator. Now, our second recommendation is to generate security baseline documents for the storage systems. Now, many organizations have those documents already for Linux, Windows, SQL, Oracle, and so forth, but not necessarily for the storage environment. In an enterprise organization, generating and adhering to a baseline is the only way to keep the storage environment secure. Let's move on to cyber resilience recommendations. Now, on the recovery side, we recommend to include cyber recoverability configurations in the security baseline documents. And the rationale here is, if being prepared to recover from a cyber attack is crucial, then relevant configurations must be included in the documents that define the minimal requirements That's simple logic. And we included here 2 examples. On the upper corner here, we have an example for an EMC data domain configuration, where they allow you to configure retention lock, a retention lock period where backup data cannot be deleted or altered in any way, shape, or form as a means to recover from ransomware. Now, this configuration isn't necessarily enabled or defined correctly, and it must be included in the baseline document so that storage systems will be built accordingly, and that this setting will also be validated from time to time. Another example below from NetApp is the configuration of file policies. Those policies can block traffic that is suspected as ransomware. Again, it is not available by default. It needs to be configured per system and correctly maintained over time. Now, moving on to more general recommendations. While many standards call to periodically update baseline documents, our recommendation is to do it continuously. And the reason is there are numerous best practice sources, and no one-time single effort can be effectively used to create a strong baseline. Organizations should continuously review guides and knowledge base and expand the best practice sources used to establish the baseline. It's the only way to keep the baseline relevant, and it's the only way to continuously improve and establish a stronger defense. In parallel to the baseline changes and growth, it's important to continuously validate the storage systems are in fact meeting the previous and the new baseline requirements, as well as industry best practices, compliance, and to make sure that they are not vulnerable.
Right. So, given the pace of changes, introductions of new technologies and best practices and configuration changes that happen all the time, how am I actually able to get it done?
So, Iris, it will certainly require some level of automation. Checking adherence to baseline and best practices should be conducted using either homegrown scripts or maybe tools like Chef and Puppet and Ansible, and preferably not manually, as it's not a repeatable process at scale. And one of the solutions that we offer at Continuity is a software product named Data Security Advisor, which enables organizations to validate on a daily basis the security of data storage system and the organization readiness to recover data in the event of ransomware or other form of attack. It has a huge knowledge base of security best practices and vulnerabilities, and it enables end users to define and automate also their own checks. Now, this is all done without any agent, using standard remote scanning techniques. This is just a screenshot of our dashboard, where you can see the overall risk status for protection and recoverability. You can see a map highlighting locations with significant risk and how those risks are divided by urgency level, impact categories, and domain areas. Now, you can drill down to a specific data center and see the list of risks that were identified. If you select a specific risk, you can preview the details of that specific risk. And if you click View More, you can actually get the full detail of the risk that was uncovered. Here we can see a NetApp system that is not enabled with ransomware protection features. You can see the urgency and severity. You can see a technical description of the problem. What is the potential impact for this problem, as well as the impacted business services. And you can see how this issue could be resolved, what commands should be executed, and what should be considered for resolution. Now, the Data Security Advisor Risk Knowledge Base includes many different categories, whether it's authentication or unauthorization, whether it's Active Directory and access control, and so forth. It includes topics like administrative access, data encryption at rest and in transit, audit logging, services, protocol ports. There are best practices that are specific for the SAN and NAS and virtual SAN and server-based SAN, which is becoming more and more common. We mentioned the veteran best practices, standards, and vulnerabilities, and of course, best practices around recoverability and much more. In terms of coverage, the built-in risk knowledge base is focusing on the storage environment. So we have coverage for block storage systems, object storage, IP storage, storage network, storage management servers are important, data protection appliances, storage virtualization, cloud storage and backup systems, essentially all those systems where critical data is kept.
Wow. Thank you very much, Yaniv, for a very educational and interesting session. And we're now going to the fun part of the webinar, the Q&A sessions. So everybody, you can submit your questions using the question pane on your webinar control panel. You can see what it might look like on your phone in the picture on the right-hand side. And we'll give people a couple minutes to get started with submitting their questions. And while we're waiting, I want to remind everybody that you have handouts attached to this webinar, which include the slides we just reviewed and the data sheet for Data Security Advisor, where you can learn more information about the product. And in addition, you'll be getting a video recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. So that's some administrative task that I have to do, but now let's see. Yaniv, I see that some questions are piling up. Are you ready to get started?
Sure.
Excellent. So let's start with the first question here that I want to pick is the question from Steve. So Steve is asking, do you see ransomware attacks on core IT systems rather than end users?
Excellent questions. So, Steve, attackers are becoming more and more sophisticated. They know exactly what they're doing, and they target specific systems and vulnerabilities. Sometimes it's a multi-phase attack where encryption of data is just the very last phase. There are reports on ransomware attacks that focus on enterprise network, and they target domain controller servers, Active Directory, storage servers. I recommend looking at, for example, at Mega Cortex. Those are some of the recent reports. But definitely, we see more and more attacks on strategic and critical infrastructure rather than on just isolated endpoints.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next question from Janet. The question is, what's the difference between a storage system and a Windows or Linux server?
Okay, so Janet, storage systems, they have their own proprietary set of commands and APIs for authentication, authorization, audit logging, encryption, access control, and so on. It's not similar to Linux and Windows in that sense. They also have their own management servers and CLI servers. These are just more service in the data centers, but they are in fact admin gateways to petabytes of critical data within the organization. In addition, the storage that is based on fiber channel network does not follow the standard TCP/IP model layer. It's an entirely different model than what most IP networks are built on.
Got it. So I see that the questions are piling up. Let's go to the question from John. Yaniv, I think you're going to like this one. John is asking, can you tell us a bit more about how your product works?
Sure. So I do have a slide about that. And the way that Data Security Advisor works is that you configure it to collect information from the storage devices, from the storage management systems. That is done remotely without any agents using read-only credentials. And you define the schedule for the collection. It could be done a couple of times a day. It could be done daily, weekly, monthly. Essentially, the user controls the schedule. Data security advisor will then collect the configuration based on the schedule and will analyze the configuration against our risk knowledge base. And whenever a violation is detected, then a ticket will be opened within the data security advisor system, which you could then review, forward, send to other systems. And essentially, we provide you with a single application to see all the security risks that are related to the systems that store your data.
Great. So, Yaniv, I'm being conscious of time here. I think we're running out of time. I do promise that we'll get back to everybody that we didn't address their questions yet, but I do think we have time for like one more question. Yaniv, should it be Bill's question? Should we go with that?
Sure.
So Bill is asking, what is the best way to resolve vulnerabilities found during this process?
Right. So if you're an enterprise organization, our recommendation is to automatically route those risk tickets to the relevant owners. In an enterprise organization, this is typically done using the IT service management system, whether it's ServiceNow or Remedy. The best thing to do is to send those risks to the appropriate owner, to have tracking on it, to have the right change management process on it. It's better than sending it by email or on a chat box or whatever. And other than that, when possible, we highly recommend to automate also the remediation of those detected risks. So if a risk is repeating and you have a script or a tool that enables you to remediate the specific risk, then allowing the administrator that is being assigned with this risk to act on it and simply trigger the relevant job to automatically remediate the risk is something that is highly recommended. And the data security advisor, among the rest, helps you also facilitate the routing of tickets and also the automatic healing portion of it.
Great. So thank you very much, Yaniv. And thank you everybody for joining us today in our webinar. We hope you find it useful and we hope to see you in our next webinar. Thank you everybody.